Hey guys, and welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind drift. Tonight, we're not wading into any dramatic royal successions or chaotic battlefield statistics. Instead, we're taking a gentle stroll into the quiet, slightly weird, and often baffling world of dinner. Specifically, all the dinners that are no longer with us. Food is such a fleeting part of history. It's made, it's eaten, and then it's gone. It's leaving behind only a stain in a medieval cookbook or a confused mention in a diary. Going to float back in time and look at some of the meals that graced the tables of Britain, from kings to commoners, and then vanished. These aren't just forgotten recipes. They're windows into a different world, a world with very different ideas about what constituted a good meal. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish. Let's begin our journey through the ghosts of dinners past. Our first stop is the medieval period. It's a time of questionable hygiene, spectacular pageantry, and a truly creative approach to presentation. When you were a wealthy noble, dinner wasn't just about eating. It was about showing off. You needed something that screamed, "I have more money and less taste than anyone else here." And for that, there was the cock and trice. The name itself sounds like something out of a mythical bestiary. And that was precisely the point. The cockatrice wasn't an actual creature, thank goodness. It was the result of a chef with a lot of time on their hands and a very literal interpretation of playing with your food. The concept was simple, in a deranged sort of way. Take the upper body of a suckling pig and sew it onto the bottom half of a capon, which is a type of chicken. Or, if you preferred, you could sew the front half of the capon to the rear end of the pig, for variety. The whole point of this culinary Frankenstein was spectacle. You wanted your dinner guests halfway through their third goblet of wine to see this thing brought to the table and be completely baffled. The name itself is a mashup of cock, for the capon, and grise, an old word for a suckling pig. It was a literal portmanteau on a platter. The preparation was, as you can imagine, a bit of an ordeal. You'd get your piglet and your large chicken, bisect them, and then carefully stitch the desired halves together. This new, unified creature would then be stuffed with a mixture of bread, eggs, sheep, suet, and a heavy-handed amount of spices. Spices were the ultimate status symbol back then. Couldn't taste subtlety, but you could definitely taste wealth. It apparently tasted like ginger and saffron. To complete the look, the cockatrice would be roasted and then gilded. This meant painting it with a glaze of egg yolks and saffron to give it a shiny, golden hue. Some chefs, feeling particularly extra, would just cover it in gold foil, because nothing says I'm powerful like eating gold leaf that will pass through your digestive system with absolutely no nutritional benefit. Sometimes they'd even stuff the pig half with other meats, like venison or mutton, a practice known as angustration. Think of it as a medieval turducken, but with more sewing and existential dread. This wasn't just a random act of culinary weirdness. It was part of a trend for subtleties or subtleties at feasts. These were elaborate, often deceptive dishes meant to entertain and impress. Food that looked like something it wasn't. A cockatrice wasn't just dinner, it was a conversation. Peace. A theatrical moment in a multi-course banquet that could drag on for hours. One of the most famous documented appearances of a cockatrice was at a feast thrown by the Bishop of Bath and Wells. On September 16th, 1425, you have to imagine he was a pretty popular guy after that sometimes. The variations got even more specific. If you stitched the capon onto the back of the pig, you could put a little helmet on the bird's head, and suddenly you had a dish called the helmeted cock. It was meant to look like a tiny otherworldly knight riding a pig into battle. Noble, delicious, and deeply unsettling night. The trend was most popular in the lavish courts of England and France, especially around the time of kings like Richard II, who was known for his love of all things theatrical and over-dash the dash top. But, like all fads, the cockatrice faded away. Tastes changed. The sheer effort and expense probably started to seem a little much, even for the ostentatiously wealthy. By the time we get to the Tudors, while feasts were still grand, this kind of explicit animal mashup became less common. The desire for spectacle remained, but it found new outlets. Which brings us gently to our next vanished meal. Let's float forward a little into the heart of the Tudor era. It's a time of religious turmoil, political intrigue, and pies that were more than just pies. We're talking about the Tudor blackbird pie, a dish immortalized in the nursery rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence. 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? Now, the immediate and slightly horrifying image is of cooked birds, somehow reanimating and singing. The reality, however, was a bit different, though no less strange. The birds weren't baked. They were alive. This was another triumph of spectacle over substance. The goal wasn't to eat the blackbirds, but to create a moment of shock and delight for the guests. The chefs of the day were masters of illusion, and the live bird pie was one of their greatest hits. Here's how it worked. A baker would craft an enormous, thick-crusted pie shell, often called a coffin. This crust was more like a sturdy container than the flaky pastry we know today. It was baked empty, sometimes filled with flour or bran to keep its shape, or even built around a wooden scaffold. Once baked and cooled, a trapdoor would be cut in the bottom. The flour or bran would be emptied out, and just before serving, the chef would slip a number of live birds inside. The pie would then be brought to the table, looking like any other massive centerpiece. The host, or an honored guest, would cut into the crust, and suddenly, a cloud of frantic, chirping birds would erupt from the pie, fluttering around the great hall. It must have been quite a scene, diverting hurly-burly, as one 18th century writer later described it. Even suggested the birds were intended to fly into the candles and plunge the room into darkness for extra chaos. This wasn't just limited to blackbirds. Cooks would put all sorts of living things in these surprise pies: frogs, rabbits, even turtles. At one particularly extravagant feast, a dwarf reportedly leaped out of a pie to recite poetry. It was the medieval equivalent of a stripper jumping out of a cake, just with more feathers and less rhythmic dancing. The nursery rhyme itself is a little historical puzzle. The earliest printed version, from around 1744, actually mentions naughty boys being baked in a pie, which is a significantly darker image. The birds replaced the boys in later versions from the 1780s. Some historians have tried to link the rhyme to specific historical events, of course. One theory connects it to King Henry VIII, with Catherine of Aragon as the queen in her parlor, and Anne Boleyn as the maid, whose nose gets pecked off, a rather gentle metaphor for her eventual beheading. Another theory, because why not, suggests it was a secret code song for the pirate Blackbeard and his crew. In that version, the pie is the ship. The blackbirds are the pirates hiding below deck, regardless of its origins. The practice of putting live animals in pies was a very real, if bizarre, form of entertainment. It was the ultimate dinner theater. An Italian cookbook from 1549. It's translated into English in 1598. Even contains a straightforward recipe for it, explaining that after the birds fly out to the delight and pleasure of the company, you can serve them a smaller actual pie hidden inside the larger shell, so they shall not be altogether mocked. Like the cockatrice, the live bird pie eventually fell out of fashion. It was a novelty, and novelties have a short lifespan. As culinary tastes evolved towards the slightly more refined, the idea of having a flock of panicked birds flying around, the dinner table probably lost its charm. The cleanup alone must have been a nightmare, so let's leave the chaos of the Tudor court behind and drift into a quieter, but no less grim corner of British culinary history. We're moving into the Victorian era, a period defined by stark contrasts: industrial progress and crushing poverty, scientific advancement and deeply questionable food choices. And it's in the shadowed kitchens and back alleys of Victorian Britain that we find our next vanished meal, slink veal. The name itself is unsettling, and for good reason. Slink veal was the meat from very young calves. When I say very young, I mean tragically so. It was harvested from either stillborn calves or more commonly unborn calves taken from their mothers who were slaughtered while pregnant. It was the youngest, most tender, and most ethically fraught meat imaginable. Veal, in general, has always been a byproduct of the dairy industry. To produce milk, cows need to give birth. Male calves, unable to produce milk themselves, were often considered surplus. Veal production was a way to get some value from them. There were different grades. Bob veal came from calves that were only a few days or weeks old. But slink veal was in a category all its own. Its consumption was driven by poverty. Slink veal was cheap. It was a source of protein for those who couldn't afford better cuts of meat. It was often sold in the grim, unregulated markets of industrial cities, where food safety was more of a suggestion than a rule. The texture was incredibly soft, almost gelatinous, because the muscle had never been used. But its reputation was understandably awful. The practice was widely condemned, even at the time. It was seen as unnatural and cruel, a step too far. In the exploitation of animals, it existed in a legal gray area for a long time, an open secret of the underbelly of the meat trade. While never a mainstream dish celebrated at fancy dinners, it was a persistent part of the diet of the urban poor. The decline of slink veal came with the rise of food regulations and a growing public consciousness about animal welfare. As the 20th century progressed, laws were put in place to standardize the meat industry. The idea of knowingly slaughtering a pregnant cow to harvest the fetus for meat became untenable. Today, the sale of slink veal is illegal in the UK, the United States, and Canada. It's a meal that vanished not because taste changed, but because society decided it was unacceptable. It represents a dark chapter in food history born from desperation and a lack of oversight. There are no quaint recipes for slink veal stew or fond memories of a slink veal pie. It was a ghost at the feast of Victorian progress, a meal that everyone knew about but nobody wanted to acknowledge. Its disappearance wasn't a loss of culinary heritage. It was a quiet, necessary step towards a more humane food system. Let's gently leave that somber note behind and float over to something a bit more decorative. We're staying in the era of grand feasts, where appearance was everything. Our next dish is one that sounds grand and poetic, but was, in reality, a masterclass in medieval recycling. Let's talk about the gilded peacocks. To the medieval mind, were the height of exotic beauty. Their iridescent feathers, their regal strut, they were living jewels. And so, of course, the nobility wanted to eat them. But cooking a peacock presents a problem. The meat is notoriously tough and dry. It's not particularly flavorful. So why was it the centerpiece of so many royal banquets? Because it was never about the taste. It was once again about the show. The process of preparing a gilded peacock was a work of art and also slightly macabre. The chef would have to very carefully skin the peacock, keeping the entire skin and all its magnificent feathers perfectly intact. This was a delicate, painstaking job. The head, with its crest, had to be preserved. The glorious tail feathers had to be kept pristine. Once the bird was skinned, the meat would be roasted. And since peacock meat wasn't great on its own, it was usually larded with pork fat and drenched in spices to make it even remotely palatable. After it was cooked, the real magic began. The chef would take the roasted carcass and redress it in its original, uncooked skin and feathers. The peacock was meticulously reassembled to look as if it were still alive. The bird would be positioned on a massive platter in a lifelike pose, perhaps with its tail fanned out in all its glory. To make it even more spectacular, its beak and feet would often be gilded with gold leaf. Sometimes a piece of camphor soaked in alcohol would be placed in its beak and lit on fire, so it appeared to be breathing flames like a mythical creature. This stunning, reassembled, fire-breathing peacock would then be carried into the banquet hall with great ceremony, often to the sound of trumpets. It was the ultimate wow factor dish. Guests would marvel at its beauty, its lifelike appearance. It was a symbol of the host's immense wealth and the incredible skill of their kitchen staff. The actual eating part was almost an afterthought. The peacock would be carved, and small portions of the tough, heavily spiced meat would be served. But the memory that lingered wasn't the taste. It was the image of that magnificent bird resurrected on a platter, a fleeting work of art made to be admired before it was consumed. The tradition of serving peacock at feasts lasted for centuries. But like so many of these ostentatious dishes, it began to fade with the changing of tastes. The turkey, introduced to Europe from the Americas, proved to be a much more delicious large bird for a celebratory meal. It was plumper, more flavorful, and didn't require an entire day of reconstructive surgery to serve. By the 17th century, the gilded peacock was largely a thing of the past, a relic of a medieval mindset where the visual feast was just as important, if not more so, than the actual food. It vanished from the menu, replaced by birds that were simply meant to be eaten. It's not admired like a piece of taxidermy. So we leave the fire-breathing, or feathered peacock behind, a marvel of medieval taxidermy and questionable cuisine, and we drift towards something equally impressive to the society of the time, but with a lot more wobble. Let's talk about jelly, not the brightly colored fruit-flavored cubes you get from a packet. No, we're talking about its ancestor, the far more elaborate and, let's be honest, slightly gruesome calf's foot jelly. The name, of course, is not a metaphor. The key ingredient for this shimmering, delicate dessert was, in fact, the humble, and frankly, quite grim, foot of a baby cow. In an age before commercially produced gelatin, if you wanted something to gel, you had to extract the collagen yourself, and the feet of young animals, along with their knuckles and bones, were packed. With it, making calf's foot jelly was not a quick or pleasant task. It was a laborious process that signaled you had a kitchen staff with a lot of time, a lot of patience, and a very strong stomach. First, your cook would have to acquire the calf's feet. They would need to be meticulously cleaned, scalded, and scraped of any hair. Then they would be put in a massive pot of water and boiled for hours and hours. The goal was to simmer them until the meat and sinew literally fell from the bone, releasing all that precious collagen into the water. The whole kitchen would have smelled, well, like boiled feet. Once the feet had given up their gelatinous soul, the resulting liquid, a cloudy and unappetizing stock, would be strained. But it wasn't ready yet. Oh no. A truly high-class jelly had to be perfectly clear like glass. This required a process called clarification. The cook would add egg whites and crushed eggshells to the cooled liquid and then gently heat it again. The egg whites would coagulate and rise to the surface, trapping all the impurities in a strange, scummy raft. This raft would then be skimmed off, leaving behind a clarified, pure liquid known as a consomme. Only then could the transformation into a grand dessert begin. The clarified stock would be sweetened with sugar, flavored with expensive wine, lemon juice, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg. And now, for the final flourish, the molding. The Georgian and Victorian eras were obsessed with elaborate jelly. Molds. They came in fantastic shapes: castles, lions, pyramids, fish, intricate geometric patterns. The flavored jelly liquid would be poured into these molds and left to set in a cool place. The end result, and turned out onto a platter, was a work of art, a shimmering, edible sculpture that would quiver tantalizingly on the table. To make them even more spectacular, cooks would color the jellies: red from cochineal, a dye made from crushed insects; green from spinach juice; yellow from saffron. They would create multi-layered jellies with different colors and flavors, or suspend things within them like preserved fruits or edible flowers, creating a beautiful stained glass effect. This wasn't just a sweet dish either. Savory jellies, known as aspics, were just as popular. Instead of sugar and wine, the clarified stock would be seasoned with herbs and vinegar and used to encase things like cooked chicken, fish, or chopped eggs. It was a way of preserving food and presenting it in a very elegant, if slightly strange, package. But the reign of the wobbly calf's foot jelly was destined to end, and its downfall came not from changing tastes, but from technology. In the 19th century, inventors figured out how to create a shelf-stable powdered gelatin. Suddenly, anyone could make jelly without the 8-hour ordeal of boiling feet. Brands like Knox in America and Roan Trees in the UK made gelatin accessible to the masses, with its primary purpose, showing off how much effort your kitchen could afford, rendered obsolete. Calf's foot jelly began a slow decline. It lost its glamour, became associated with something else entirely. Food for invalids, because it was easily digestible and thought to be nourishing. Doctors would often prescribe plain, unflavored calf's foot jelly to patients recovering from illness. From the king's table to the sickbed, a rather sad trajectory for such a once glamorous dish. It vanished from the menu, a victim of its own complexity in a world that was rapidly discovering convenience. From the shimmering heights of the desert table, let's descend. Way, way down. Down to the bits and pieces left over after the main event, or floating away from the jellies and landing in a medieval forest in the aftermath of a great deer hunt. We're here to talk about a dish whose name you probably know, but whose ingredients you almost certainly don't. We're talking about humble pie. You've heard the phrase, of course. To eat humble pie? It means to suffer humiliation, to admit you're wrong and apologize. It's a common enough idiom, but the pie it comes from wasn't originally humble at all. It was umble, spelled with a U. The umbles were a specific part of the deer. Imagine the scene. A medieval lord and his noble guests have spent the day hunting. They've successfully brought down a magnificent stag. The hunt is over, the deer is butchered, and a great feast is prepared. The lord naturally gets the best cuts of venison, the backstraps, the haunches, the prime meat. But a deer is a large animal. What about the rest of it? The heart, the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, and other internal organs. These less desirable but still perfectly edible parts were known collectively as the numbles or umbles, a term derived from a Latin word for loin, but which came to mean offal. And these umbles were given to the servants, the huntsmen, and the lower-ranking members of the party. It was their reward for a successful hunt. And the most common way to prepare this pile of offal was to chop it all up, mix it with suet, season it heavily with pepper and other spices. So maybe add some currants or apples for a bit of sweetness, and bake it all in a thick pastry crust. The result was humble pie. This wasn't a delicate dish for the high table. It was a dense, rich, and deeply savory meal. It was hearty, filling, and it made use of every part of the animal. In a world where food could be scarce, you didn't waste the protein. The flavor would have been intensely gamey, a far cry from a modern steak and kidney pie, which is perhaps its most distant living relative. So how did this offal-filled pastry give us our modern phrase? It was a simple matter of social hierarchy, baked into a pie. At the post-hunt feast, the lord and his nobles would be dining on roasted venison. The servants and hunters, meanwhile, would be eating the humble pie. So, to be seen eating humble pie was to literally be in a lower, more subservient position at the table. Over time, the word humble and the word humble became intertwined. They sounded almost identical, and the context was just too perfect to ignore. The pie of the lowly became the pie of the humbled. By the 17th century, people were already using the phrase to eat humble pie in its modern, metaphorical sense. A simple pun, really. It was so fitting it stuck for the next 600 years. The dish itself was eventually lost to time. As hunting practices changed and venison became less of a staple meat, the specific tradition of making humble pie faded. Tastes. Also shifted away from such intense, gamey offal. People still ate pies, of course. The specific recipe and the name that went with it fell into obscurity. But the phrase, of course, lived on, completely detached from its culinary origins. It's a strange little piece of culinary ghosting where the flavor is gone. The ingredients are forgotten, but the meaning remains, preserved in our language like an insect in amber. Every time someone grudgingly apologizes, they are unknowingly referencing a long-vanished, offal-filled pie they would probably never, ever want to eat.